All right, so off the top of my head, the stuff that was missing from the cultural context post number 4 was how does Indigenous knowledge relate to social justice? And for me, the best illustration of that is over the last term, our school in New Zealand, we had an initiative where the whole school had to learn the Haka. We've got a population of roughly like 50% immigrants from the Pacific Islands, India, China, etc. About 10 to 15% Pākehā, and about 40% roughly Māori. So the obvious question that a lot of the kids asked was, why do we have to do this if we're not Māori? What does this have to do with my learning? And that was really hard to deal with. It was very frustrating for me. I think it's really important to acknowledge when you can and incorporate the local Indigenous knowledge into what you do as often as possible in order to make it the norm and a way of looking at things that is just as acceptable as any post-colonialist or postmodernist view of how we do things. So in the group that I work with, we try to change the question into why are we doing this to what does it mean to do a haka as a non-Māori. And my personal explanation for that was, well, to me it means that I'm doing exactly that. I'm acknowledging the First Peoples and their knowledge and incorporating that into daily practice, and celebrating the fact that we are now a multicultural society, and that means that we do these things to acknowledge all parts of our society and what they offer us in terms of their knowledge. The other thing we happened to talk about at the time was a series of events that happened in my hometown. So while I was here in New Zealand, us all learning to haka, in my hometown there was there's a lot of kids that come to the school off the reservation because the local reservation is appalling living conditions, as are many, the majority of First Nations reservations in Canada. And so often people will send their kids to town schools in the hopes that that will better their socioeconomic social mobility. Doesn't usually work. Pretty much disconnects them from their family and culture, depending on how solid the cultural base was anyway. And what happened was a year 9 boy was murdered by another bunch of boys of the same age, all from the reserve as well. And my thinking is that if Indigenous culture were incorporated more often, and I'm not saying that we do that a lot or do it particularly well in New Zealand, but in comparison to where I come from, the status of Māori in New Zealand, while is not by any means to be interpreted as equal or on an equal footing or as unaffected by colonialism, it is represented more than what Canadians' First Nation culture is. So I wonder if had the kids and community had a better understanding of restorative justice, and from a First Nations perspective, that concept, it comes from the idea of harmony and balance. So harmony is part and parcel of who you are as a First Nations person and your understanding of your place within the world. So where you sit in harmony with nature, with people, and with the spirit world determines the quality of what is happening around you. And when the world is put out of harmony, then that's when bad things happen, and it is through restorative justice processes, as we would like to call them in a Western context, that harmony is then restored. So in terms of crime, that would be to both the victim and the offender, to make sure that the healing is for everyone involved. So I wondered about, as we learned Tahaka and shared that part of Māori Indigenous knowledge, and actually watched as the status of the Māori in the school was elevated, and kids participate that didn't ever participate before, take leadership roles, and be teaching the teachers and as well as their peers things that kids who had never spoken publicly, some possibly hadn't completed anything ever in the last couple of years, were now prominent leaders in our school, and it was really quite something to see. And the eventual pride, actually, that I'm going to say almost the entire school took in that endeavor, in the struggle to learn how to do this thing. And I wonder if knowledge of smudging or sweat lodging or learning a jingle dance to open a powwow, if that was a part of the shared knowledge in a multicultural school in Canada, if harmony would have been so out of balance. And in particular, the events that followed the murder, the police actually came into the school demanding to talk to kids without parents, without lawyers, without supervision, and the principal and the teachers barred them from going. So it was actually quite a big deal. From a Native perspective, that would have thrown things further out of balance because of the disharmony in the community and taking advantage of children's vulnerability, not presuming innocence, not truly searching for information in the most productive way, under the guise of Western justice. I don't think that, I would like to think that that wouldn't have happened had more knowledge been shared. And shared knowledge is quite a difficult thing, I think, for Indigenous communities as well. When I went to a Sacred Lands conference back in 1997, that was an issue between like Māori and Canada First Nations, where they were talking about cultural tourism as a means of holding onto language and holding onto culture. And most of the elders in Canada were very against that because some of it is considered very sacred knowledge and is not for sharing. But in the modern digital world of connectivity and collaboration, it may be that sharing is now the key to maintaining harmony and culture. So if I talk about the kaitiakitanga or my responsibilities as a teacher, to me, it's to make sure that there is a platform for the Indigenous knowledges wherever I am at as a teacher, as well as my own and what I bring. Because without that, it's a one-sided conversation, and there has to be that sharing and collaboration in order for all of us to bring harmony to our teaching and learning environment and society, really. I think the very last example I could have of that is in Canada. I think about 2 years ago there was something called the Silent No More movement, and similar to Māori, the educational, medical, criminal statistics for Aboriginal people in Canada is appalling and grim. And the Silent No More movement actually has triggered, the biggest wave would be eco-sustainability and First Nation people involvement in those types of movements. And I think that by a younger generation deciding that no, we're not silent, and no, we will share our knowledge and our values, because if we don't, we may be lost. It's a very important part of a teacher's role in order to sustain that, whether they are Indigenous or not, to make sure that they are informing future contributors to society, that there is more than one lens.